What we want to do is do a comparison of exactly what you need to do from a marketing perspective to make the income you want to make. And unfortunately, I would easily say 95% of the doctors don't do this. They never pick an income they want to make, and they never put a plan together to go get it. I'd easily say, and from my experience, that's 95%. Most people just go, I want to make more money. They just go, I want to make more money, and they don't put a plan to it. And of course, that doesn't get you anywhere. So we're actually going to go over how to put the marketing plan together to get the money that you want to make. So let's start with the money you want to make first. And we're going to use some average numbers to do some calculations. So what is well, that's the very first thing you got to choose. And most doctors never choose that. They never choose that I want to make $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year. They don't even do that. And if you don't write it down, there's a 97% chance it will not be done. I don't know if you know of the Harvard study. They found pretty much that if you don't write down what you want, your goal, there's a 97% chance you're not going to get it. So there's a lot of components to goals, but one of them is writing it down. And that's why a marketing calendar is so important, by the way, also. You got to write down what you're going to do. There's got to be a blueprint to get to where you want to go. It can't just be hope and mirrors. So as an example, I remember when I first started in practice, I thought, man, it'd be great to make $100,000 a year. So that was my goal. I wrote down, I'd like to make $100,000 a year. And then I just kind of wrote down some of the things I'm going to do to get that. Well, now this was after I was trained and I knew what I was doing. I was surprised how easy that happened when I started my practice. Again, this was after I was trained. When I started my practice, it went from 0 to 100 visits a week in 60 weeks. And my first year, I profited $232,000. Now, I was only shooting for 100,000, but I profited 232. So I'm going, okay, well, what's next? Did I just want to stay there? Well, to be honest with you, I was kind of bored. I had real low overhead. My overhead at that time was 16%. It was real low. So the national average is 50%. So I thought, well, I was bored seeing 120 visits a week, something like that. And I'm like, well, let's get busy. Since I'm here, I might as well get busy. So then I started cranking up the business. And I go, well, instead of 100,000, let's shoot for 250,000. Well, that happened immediately. And I go, okay, what now? In other words, was 250,000 ever on my radar when I started chiropractic? Never. I never thought I'd ever make $250,000 a year. It was not even on my radar. And then I make 250 and I go, well, what now? I go, well, let's shoot for 500. I didn't do too big of a, in other words, if I would have tried to go from 0 to 500,000, I'd have probably fell on my face because it was too much. I'd had too much negative feedback and I'd been trying to do too much. So going incrementally was a large part of this also. So I go, okay, well, let's do 500,000. And then I put in place the plan. What do I need to do to make $500,000 a year? Now, let me just say a couple things about money. Number one, when we talk about $500,000 a year, the industry standard is that you always talk about it as after overhead. So you'd never say, I make $500,000 a year and you haven't included overhead. That's not how the industry talk is. It's always after overhead, before taxes. That's how money is talked. When people go, I make $80,000 a year, 70, it's always after overhead, before taxes. Okay, so let's be clear of where we're at first with money. So when I say I want to make $500,000 a year, it's after overhead. Well, the overhead's 50%. So we're going to include in 50%. So if I wanted to make 500,000 a year, I had to collect $1 million. And what's important is collection, not production. In other words, real money. Production's fake money. So we want to make sure we're collecting real money, not fake money. So I said, and I still remember this. As a matter of fact, I still have the legal pad. I wrote this down on a legal pad. I still have the legal pads of all the goals and the incomes that I wanted over like a 10-year period as I was growing my business. I wrote it down. I wrote it down where I was at, where I wanted to go, and then how I was going to get there. Is there any reason now you can see why I ended up opening 77 offices in 20 states? It was not an accident. It was a clear path and clarity of how to get from point A to point B. And then when I met point B, I just took the same formula and I adjusted it up. So then I did 500. Well, I did 500,000 immediately. There was not one year that went by that I did not meet that financial goal that I set. Now, did I need to make $500,000 a year? No. Now it just became a challenge. Now it was just challenging. It was something to do, something to chase after. It was a sense of achievement, helping people. It was just fulfilling to grow. That's what it was. And of course, you get all the byproducts from the money, which is fine. Okay, but did I ever want a private limo? No. Did I ever want a second home in Florida? No. Did I ever want a 40-foot yacht? No. These things just happen as you grow. You allow yourself, and a lot of people don't. A lot of people do not allow themselves to expand mentally. There's a lot of chiropractors that are just flat out stuck. And they've been stuck there quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, year after year after year after year. And this is why. I'm just sharing you right now the core reason why. They don't pick what they want. They don't put a plan in place to do it. And they don't have a good reason why to go get it. Those are the three reasons it doesn't happen. So number one is you actually have to pick the money you want. You have to actually pick it. So after I picked 500,000, I made that. I go, well, let's just go for $1 million. Then I went for $1 million. And then I went from $1 million to $2 million. I said, well, let's go for $2 million. And that's how it all happened. That's how I kept growing from one office, only wanting to make $100,000 a year, to doing 77 offices in 20 states, collecting $90 million a year. I didn't start off that way. I just allowed myself to grow and I put a plan in place to do it. That's it. Now, so number one is you've got to pick the money. And a lot of people are afraid to pick the money. And they won't write it down. Or it'll be grossly too much. In other words, it'll be a target that they won't obviously be able to attain, which allows for you to quit. So a lot of these components become very important. You can miss one of these components, like shoot too big, create a lot of negative feedback, and you'll quit. And sometimes you'll quit the rest of your life. You won't even try again. So some of these topics are invaluable, like short-term steps, achievable steps. That's huge. Now, the next category is why. And this is a huge, this is the motivation of why you're going to do it or not. Why? Why do you want to make 100,000? Why do you want to make 500,000? Why do you want to make $1 million? Well, when you're in survival and security, you don't need a why. That alone is self-motivation. When you're trying to put a roof over your head, food in your stomach, security in your environment, that's enough for most people to get off their ass and do something. That's natural motivation. That's not the problem. The problem is when chiropractors hit that. And you can hit that seeing 70 visits a week, and it depends on what other sources of income you have. If your wife's making a good income, that could be a lot less. You could putz out at 40 visits a week and have no more natural motivation. So again, are you in survival or security? That a lot is what drives. I was just talking to a doctor. He was seeing 70 visits a week, renting. He's been stuck in there. He was thinking about getting out of chiropractic. Well, see, that created natural motivation for him to act and get out of that, for him to actually do something differently than what he was doing. That was natural pain, natural motivation. Well, as soon as you start making X amount of money and you get out of survival and security, that's when 80% of the people puts out, because natural motivation goes away for 80% of the people. Only 20% of the people have what's called internal pain, that they'll keep driving and driving, even though everything's covered. Their survival, their food, their shelter, they're in abundance. They'll still keep driving. I was one of those guys. It didn't matter how much money I made. I was still going to drive. I was still going to push. There's only about 20% of the population that's like that. And it's built in. And it's actually, and I talk about this totally separately when I talk about what creates motivation, is that it was imprinted motivation as a child. But that's not 80% of the population. Now, how do you know if you're one of those people? Well, did you putz out? Have you plateaued quarter after quarter and you're doing nothing to change it? You're that 80%, which means the next topic becomes very important. The why. Why do you want to make that money after you're out of security? That's going to be the single most important factor because it'll determine if you're going to act or not. It'll determine if you're going to change your habits. The why. So what are the components of why? Well, number one, the reasons we do things, number one, is for money. Well, that's great if you're in survival and security, and you should do it for money to get out of survival and security, because that's what money will do. It'll create survival and security. So when you're at that low of a level, doing something for money is important, and it's good to do it for money to get some stability in your life. Okay. Now, once that happens, what's the next reason? Personal gain. Well, personal gain's not real strong. Personal gain, and do you want a Lamborghini? Do you want a boat? It's not real strong. It's not real strong. A lot of people won't succeed very much in life because of personal gain. It's not a very strong motivator. The next level is conviction. That's a high motivator. Now, we only get conviction in two ways. Either from a personal, emotional experience, like me. I was helped by a chiropractor when I was 15 years old. Medical doctors couldn't help me at all from a tailbone injury. I went for months. They couldn't do anything. I went to a chiropractor, and in 3 treatments in 5 days, I was 100% normal. And that's without any medication, surgery, nothing. You can't tell me chiropractic doesn't work. It allowed me to sit down again as a 15-year-old with no pain. So you get conviction in 2 ways, either a personal experience. Now, obviously, the deeper the personal experience, the higher the conviction. Now, is that personal experience affecting your survival or security? That'll create a deep conviction. If it's just stopping you from playing Little League baseball, it's not going to affect your conviction that much. Okay. The second way is studying it over time. And I give the analogy with religion all the time. Some people, they just hit rock bottom and man, they just switch over and they find God. That's not most people. Most people eventually seek out God, and then they go to church and they more and more, and they've developed friends and build their network. And then they study it over time, and they become more spiritual, more aware, more self-enlightened over time. So that's the other way to help conviction, is to study something over time. And this is what I did with my associate doctors. They typically come in and were terrible with understanding the science of the 3 phases of healing and how chiropractic helps. They couldn't even explain it to an average person. And this was after they graduated. So I had to spend a lot of time on conviction. So we had to study the 3 phases of healing a lot. We had to do a lot of case analysis, comparing the cases and the biomarkers and they had to experience it. So it took about 3 to good 6 months for me to develop a real high conviction with my doctors with what they were doing with chiropractic physical medicine, what was actually happening scientifically relative to the science of healing. And then being able to equate that relative to the patient's test and biomarkers. And as the patient went through the 3 phases of healing, what biomarkers showed up, and so what were the appropriate tests to do and why physiologically. It took me 3 to 6 months to increase somebody's conviction to where they're like, yeah, I got it. We understand the 3 phases. Here's the 3 phases. Here's the biomarkers here, which this would be the therapy that I would help scientifically with that. Here's the biomarkers here. This is what I'd help scientifically with that. And here's the biomarkers in the 3rd phase. And this is how I'd help scientifically. Okay. So that's how I created strong chiropractic, a belief system. Now that was important because there's only 8% utilization. And if you don't have a conviction system, you're not going to be very strong in marketing. Matter of fact, you won't even want to ask for referrals because you don't even believe it that much. But once you understand it and believe it, and you're like, no, this really helps people, and it's very unique, and it's the only profession that actually affects the healing in all 3 phases. And if you don't, the person ends up having a permanent problem to some degree. Once you understand that, it is no problem talking about chiropractic and how it helps and works and getting new patients. Matter of fact, there's a motive to do it. And it's not a money motive. It's just, I want to help people because I know they're going to have permanent problems if they don't to some degree. So anyway, which gets us to the 4th reason, self-actualization. Now that's when you do it for a higher cause. That's when there's a cause bigger than you. And by the way, this is why doctors that believe in subluxations are so strong. It's almost cult-like. It's like a religion. This is why, because it's no longer about money, personal gain, or conviction. It's about a bigger calling. This is why you see subluxation, some of these subluxation doctors you would think of them as maniacs. Well, it's called self-actualization. They're doing it for a higher calling. Matter of fact, they know this when they go to seminars. That's why they'll teach everybody in the seminar. They'll say, you're saving lives. That's why they'll do that, is to take them to a higher calling. Why take them to a higher calling? Because then they'll have the conviction to give the recommendations, to be able to talk about the money, to create referrals. They'll have the ability to do all that because it's a higher calling. It's a higher calling. Self-actualization. So you got to pick the money first. And then it's got to be for somewhat of a strong reason. And I'll give one example. I had one doctor, and I'll move on from this and actually start calculating this up. But this is why doctors do not excel. I can look at one doctor who is not increasing his business from quarter to quarter. And I can almost guarantee it's one of these 3 things. They have not picked a specific money. They don't have a plan to put it there. And they don't have a good reason, high motivating reason to do it. That's the absolute 3 reasons they're stuck quarter after quarter after quarter after year after year after year. That's why. You can see it over and over again. And the doctors who do change and grow, what do they have in common? They know what they want. They have a plan in place. If they don't have a plan, they hire somebody like me to teach them the plan, to get them from point A to point B. In other words, they go out of their way to learn how to do it, and then they have a good reason. Now, a lot of times when they come to me, the reason is to get out of survival and security because they're not doing well. They're renting, they're driving a 5-10-year-old car, they're renting an apartment, and they're wondering why they got a $200,000 student loan. And they're seeing, 60 visits a week or something. Well, that's survival. That's a very different reason. So understanding it. So as an analogy, if you can't do this on your own, in other words, if you don't understand this, you don't apply it. So let's say you're one of the 80% that putzes out after survival and security. In other words, how do you know that? Because you're not willing to do anything different from quarter to quarter. That's how you know you're one of those people. That's how. Now, when you're the person that's willing to change and grow and spend time or money and learn and change, you're not one of those people. You're eventually going to get there. So it may be a different route, or you can hire somebody like me who's done it and go from point A to point B fast, or you can go through experience and waste a lot of time or money and take a lot of time and all that, before you eventually get a little higher. That's the difference that mentors make. It takes you from point A to point B the fastest versus experience. So anyway, this doctor puts out, zero motivation. He's seeing, I think, 100 visits a week, roughly. He's making about $150,000 a year. Plus his wife is a blue collar worker. She's making about 30 or 40. So, he's making $150,000 to $250,000. Well, he's definitely out of survival or security, and he's not one of the 20%ers. So he totally putzes out. So were we able to work with him? Well, I had to find his self-actualization. So I had to interview him. First, he had to understand this process. I go, personal gain is not going to do it. You're not going to do shit for the money. At that level, you're not going to change anything for the money. Conviction definitely helps. I said, we need to go to self-actualization. We need to do it for a higher calling, a higher cause. So I had to interview him to find out what he cared about, what he immensely cared about that was like tugging at him. Well, I found out that he really respected his father-in-law. He did not want to let his father-in-law down. Now, that's partly why he pushed to get to where he was, because he was a success. He was doing more than the average chiropractor, but he putzed out. So that feeling, that part of that feeling pushed him to get to where he was, that he didn't want to let his father-in-law down, that he's taking care of his father-in-law's daughter. See, that's huge. That affects a lot of people, which is great. Okay, so then he putzes out. So now I'm going in to find out what we could tie into. Now, you've got to be able to find this out on your own if you don't have somebody that can help you. You've got to look at yourself. And so we find out that his father-in-law. So I said, here's what we're going to do. Let's plan what we're going to do with your practice. Like whatever, I forget what the exact numbers are. Let's take it up to 200 visits a week. So it makes this amount of money, 200. Well, there was no reason behind it because we'd been talking about that for a year. It was worthless. He wasn't willing to change anything for a year, even though he wanted to make more money, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It wasn't till there was a reason, a high conviction, self-actualization reason, that he was willing to change his actions. And so we connected the money, and we said, well, why don't we found out that their parents really like doing cruises. I said, I'll tell you what, why don't we connect your growth to you buying them a cruise? Because I already know he didn't want to let them down. He valued his father-in-law, and we wanted to give something they valued. So we said, well, let's give them a week-long cruise, and you make the announcement. Matter of fact, you give it to them in a card saying you get a week-long cruise as soon as I hit 200 visits a week. And I said, we're going to come up with the plan, how we're going to take your practice from your 100 plus visits a week to 200. So we're going to do this, this, and this. In other words, what he was not willing to do. So we put the plan in place that would do it. That we'd done that a year before. He just wasn't willing to do it because there was no impetus. There was no good reason why. This is why people talk about purpose so much. Finding your purpose. Your purpose is what blasts you through barriers, which overcomes issues, which overcomes the no's, which overcomes the fears, the negative self-talk. It's called purpose. Purpose is self-actualization, doing it for a higher cause. Okay. And we put a time frame on it. We said, let's do it in 6 months. He did it in 60 days. 60 days. So we spent over a year trying to talk him into doing better, better, better. It was worthless. until we connected with his self-actualization. He didn't want to let his parents down. He didn't want to let his father-in-law down. And it was a limited time, and it was something they valued. And just like that, in 60 days, it was met. What was the whole difference? Purpose. So if you're not writing it down, you're not going to get it. If there's not a purpose, you're not going to get it. It can't be a weak purpose. I want a Lamborghini. Personal, that's worthless. That's a pleasure motivated, and it's worthless. So as another example with me, one of the things I did is I financed an 8,000 square foot wing onto the local church. I did that on purpose. So I had to cut the check for the mortgage. So I put that into the plan. So I go, okay, I have to make this, got to put it into the plan, because this is what it's going to cost monthly to build an 8,000 square foot wing onto the church. Well, do you think I'm going to let the church down? I'll fight, kick, and scream before I let that church down. I'll be going out there and doing blood pressure screenings before I let that church down. That's the importance of why. You don't have a good why, you got nothing. You're just yapping. You're spinning your wheels. So these things have to be in place. You got to pick where you want to go first. Well, what do you want to make? Can't be too damn big. That'll create a lot of negative feedback and shut you down. Well, when I went for $100,000 out of school, that wasn't too big. And when I went from 100 to 200,000, that wasn't too big. If I'd have probably went from 100 to 500, that'd have been too big, or 100, that'd have been too big. I'd have been setting myself for rejection for what it would have taken to do that. So these are major concepts to get ahead in life. And you've got to understand them. You've got to control them, and you've got to apply them, unless you've got somebody else who's going to help you do it. And most people don't even understand how this works. They just get stuck, and then they blame everything else. They blame everything else except themselves why they're stuck. So number one, you got to pick your number and you got to write it down. Now, whatever it is, it's got to be twice, because your overhead's 50%. So if you want to make 100,000, it better be 200. You want to make $250,000, it better be 500. Okay. So you got to write it down. It's got to be twice for your overhead. There's got to be a reason. What's the single most important out of all of this? There better be a solid reason why you want to do it. Maybe you want to buy your wife a better house. You know, the house you're living in is very mediocre, maybe middle, lower class, blue collar. And you're like, man, my wife deserves money more than that. I want to take care of my wife and my family. See, that's a higher calling. I want my kids to go to private school. That's a higher calling. Not I want a Lamborghini. So you got to have a reason why you want to do it. It's got to be a high value reason called self-actualization or conviction. In other words, purpose. It's got to be a purpose. So what are you willing to fight for? That's what it's about. So next you come over. What's the next thing? You okay, I got my number. I got my reason. Well, what's missing? The plan. Go, how am I going to get there? That's what we're going to go through right now. We're going to walk through the plan. How are you going to do it? Okay. So let's walk through the formula. What is the blueprint? Now here's what we're going to do. And I suggest you do this live, like now. As we do it, you do it. Okay. You write it down. You write down your numbers. You write down your reason. Because until you do, it's not going to happen. I see it all the time. Doctors not willing to do this, 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 but yet they expect to make a larger income. It's pie in the sky bullshit. So let's go through the formula. Here's the formula. We go, let's say we want to make 500,000. Let's say we want to make $250,000 a year. Okay. So we want 250. So that means we need to collect 500. We need to collect $500,000. You write your number down. All right. So what is the marketing plan we're going to produce to get to this point? How are we going to get there? That's exactly what we're doing right now. We're going to lay out the total trail. We're going to go into the marketing calendar of exactly what needs to be done for that to happen, to get to that point. Okay, so we're at $500,000. What's the next thing we got to do? We got to figure out how many new patients we need. Well, how do we do that? Well, we take the $500,000 and divide it into your patient visit, your dollar per visit. So you take 500,000, divide that, and we're just going to divide it into 50. The national average, let's say it's $50 per visit. So we're going to divide it by 50. That's going to tell us the number of patient visits. So we need 10,000 patient visits that year. Okay. Now, how many new patients does that mean? Well, you're going to take your patient visits, how many visits, and you're going to divide that by your patient retention. So how do you do that? You take a time frame, a minimum of 3 months to 6 months. You go back a minimum of 3 months to 6 months, and you take your total number of patient visits, divided your new patients into your patient visits. That gives you your patient visit average. That's the average number of times somebody's coming to see you. Now, this is also another major reason why patient retention is so important. You got bad patient retention, you're going to need twice, 3 or 4 times the amount of new patients. You've got good patient retention, you're going to need a lot less new patients. Now, our patient retention is based on the science of the 3 phases of healing, and then we add on the lifestyle. So we have very legitimate reasons, high conviction reasons, why patients should stay with us through the inflammation phase, the repair phase, the remodel phase, and then after that's over, they should continue staying with us, what's called the lifestyle phase. So our patient retentions should easily be 30, 40, 50, 60 patient retention averages. Now, the national average is 18. 18, that's the national average of patient retention, okay? So we need 10,000 patient visits. Divide in your patient retention. So let's say, like my patient retention was 28. Wasn't high, wasn't low. It's 20, I was comfortable with 28. So 28. So I'm going to use my patient retention, 28. You use yours. And by the way, you should know your patient retention. So 10,000 divided by 28, that's 357. So I need 357 new patients at a $50 per visit at a 28 patient retention to meet my $500,000, my $250,000 income, 500,000 total collection. So now I'm going to take my new patients and divide it into months. 357 divided by 12, 357 divided by 12, that's 29. So I need 29 new patients to make at my numbers, $50 per visit. See, so this is why dollar per visit matters, patient retention matters. All of these skill sets matter because they make it easier. They make it less costly in the amount of new patients you need. So if you're terrible and not good with patient retention, you're in real trouble. You're going to need a lot of new patients. And if you don't have the skills with patient retention, chances are you don't have the skills with marketing either. So we need 29 new patients. Okay, where are we going to get them? Well, let's go ahead and plot where we're going to get the new patients. Now, we got to know some basic, first we got to know what are all the categories of new patients to pick and choose from, right? We got to know some basic things about marketing. And then we go, well, what marketing is going to work best versus least? But then you've got to go, what marketing are you willing to do? Because there's a lot of doctors not willing to talk in front of a group of people, even though it's the single best thing you could do to get new patients. This is where also purpose comes in. You have a weak purpose and you're afraid of talking to people, you're not going to do it. But if you're afraid of talking to people and you got a real strong purpose, a lot of times that purpose will overcome your weakness of willing to talk to people. See, there's so many points that make this come true. And so you could lose out. So we already know the marketing. We already know what it is. Generally speaking, the more interactive, we already know there's 3 types of marketing. There's publicity, there's advertising, and there's educational sales. We already know you're limited when you use publicity and advertising to only the 8% that are looking for a chiropractor. Okay. So we're already handicapping ourselves if we're not willing to do educational sales. We either don't know it or we're not willing to do it. Now, if you're not willing to do it, what's the number one reason doctors aren't willing to do educational sales? They don't have the conviction. They don't have the conviction and the purpose. That's why they don't do it. The doctors have the conviction and the purpose, easily do it and get a lot of new patients. So then you go, okay, that's the advertising. And then we look at the marketing. We go, well, where do all the patients come from? Well, generally speaking, we already know that when you use educational sales, combining that with circle of influence, that's the highest probability, the best marketing there is. So it's going to take less. Now, what we're going to pay attention to are what I'm going to call hits. Sometimes you can talk to somebody once and get them as a new patient. There's certain situations where that occur. Sometimes they got to see your message 100 times before they act and come in. That's called advertising. There's a huge spectrum and difference of effectiveness of marketing. You got to know this because you're going to need a certain number of hits. In other words, I'm going to need a certain number of hits to create 29 new patients a month. Now, if it was a one-to-one relationship, I would only need 29 hits. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's very few times there's a one-to-one relationship. And this is the other part that doctors just don't get. They don't realize how many times they actually have to ask a referral before they actually get one. And they never get through those numbers. They never do. And they never get the new patients. So, and you've heard the language that you have to contact somebody 7 times before they actually act. Well, that's a very good generalization. That's not true if you're using educational sales with high circle of influence with a gateway. That's not true at all. It's not going to be 7 at all. That's going to be close to 1-to-1. In other words, it's going to be very hard not to get this person as a new patient. When it's a spout, remember, the highest probability patient is the one living under the same roof, because we already know there's already trust as your existing patients. And it's real easy to find out if they have a chiropractic gateway, which is very important. So if they have back pain, neck pain, arthritis, joint pain, and they're living under the same roof, that's absolutely the highest probability patient, because we already have the trust. We already have the need to some degree. So I just have to deliver the formula. Establish the need, minimize time or money. I already got trust. I get them as a new patient. That's it. That's all I got to do to get them as a new patient. And there's vehicles to do that. The best vehicle is one-on-one. That's the absolute best. So in other words, if I actually had a spouse, let's say I had 10 patients, they were all patients, and I had their spouses come in. And when they came in, all of them had a gateway problem, all of them. And then all I did is went through the educational sales formula. I established need. I minimized the obstacles of time or money. I already have the trust. I'm going to be at 1-to-1. In all likelihood, I'm going to sign up all 10. In other words, how many hits? It's only going to take 1 hit. But what did I need to know to do that? I had to know educational sales. I had to have the experience to do it. I had to have the ability to do it. And I had to have the willingness to do it, which gets back to motive. Are you going to get off your butt or not? That's what it gets back to. So that's the easiest patient. And then it gets, when you start going to mother and father, it's not as of, when you get outside of the roof, it gets a little less, but it's still strong because there's a lot of empathy when you go to mother, father. So if I have a mother, father, and I have a gateway, I still have a high probability, but now it depends, what's the vehicle of delivery? Well, if I talk with them directly and I do educational sales, that's off the charts. That's called a new patient orientation. That's called a presentation. That's called a patient appreciation day. See, that's what that's called. It's called getting right in front of the high circle of influence, the high trust that has a gateway problem, and then touching all the key components that get them to act. Establish need, minimize time or money, and you already have the trust. Then they take the first step and act. Well, that's a real high percentage. It's not going to take a lot of hits. See, so so I'm at the second tier. The first tier is under the same roof. Second tier is mother, father. Then the next tier would be brother, sister. Not as strong, brother or sister. So it's getting weaker. So remember, I'm looking at two categories. What's the method of the marketing? Are you using publicity, advertising, or educational sales? Remember, advertising will only work to those people. In other words, if you just handed out advertising, it would only work to 8% of them, the ones that were actually looking for a chiropractor in the next year. That's it. That's not right. That's not true with educational sales. You can actually get all of them. So this is the difference in the vehicle that you're using with your marketing. And publicity is even less. So you'd have to do a lot more publicity to those same 10 people to get them than advertising, because publicity only affects trust. It doesn't minimize the obstacles or affect need. That's why it works the least. Then you can do advertising, which eliminates the obstacles, doesn't establish need. So it works better than publicity, but it's still, if they're not looking for a chiropractor, it doesn't matter. And that's why educational sales works so good. If they have a problem, they'll get them to come in and eliminate establishes need, shows the solution, eliminates time and money, and you have third-party trust. That's why it works so great. It works so great. And it works better when you go to under the house, to the closest under the house, the mother, father, and then brother, sister. And as you go further down the line, it takes more hits. But it's still way better. It's still way better to do an educational sales presentation to somebody where there's no circle of influence. In other words, it's a cold call. But let's say they have a problem, because we know 7 out of 10 people in the population have a gateway problem. So I could round up 10 people and 7 of them will have back pain, neck pain, arthritis, headaches to some degree. I can do a shot in the dark and have targets new patients in front of me. But let's say that I filter the audience, so there's no trust. They don't know me, I don't know them, but I see they have a problem. They got back pain, neck pain. Well, I'm still going to have a higher probability because when I use educational sales. Now, if I use advertising, I won't. Again, that's only if they're looking for a chiropractor. So knowing this, how many hits is the key to your solution? Well, the hits depend on the method you're going to use. Your target market, your method. If I use a real high probability target market with educational sales, I'm not going to have to do very many hits, meaning proactive, something you do proactively. That's what that means, a hit. Interact. I literally could only do 29, and I'll have 29 new patients. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's go to cold calls. The average, what's considered average advertising, is 1 out of 100. That's what's considered average. So you go, how much money is it going to cost you? Because now it's going to cost you money. At one end of the spectrum, it's knowledge and skill. The other end of the spectrum, it's money. That's what you're looking at. And then you go, well, how many hits is it going to take to get 29 new patients over here? Cold call patients, because they're cold call patients. You don't know if they have a problem. So you got to go through a lot of people. I remember doing they have these little Valpak discount coupons. Usually there's 20 businesses and it's cheaper to send out. I remember sending that out. It might cost $400, $600. You might get 2 new patients from that. That's it. Then the average chiropractor that loses those 2 new patients in 6 visits, they can't even do it again. I got those 2 new patients, got them both to stay for 28 visits, and then I got 1.5 referrals after them, and they stayed for 20.5 visits, and I got 1.5 referrals after them. So by the time that played out, I ended up with 4 to 5 new patients at a $50 per visit at 28 visits. I'm making $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 from spending $400. The other chiropractor lost money. This is the difference it makes when you have the knowledge and skill. So when we come down to this bad end of the spectrum of marketing, because it decreases in effectiveness. Then you go down to 100 hits. Well, how many, if it's going to take 100 hits, imagine if you had to ask somebody, you had to ask your 100 patients before you got 1 referral. Would you make it through that? Would you get to the 100? You wouldn't even do it. You wouldn't probably even get to the 2nd or 3rd time of asking because you'd have quit due to rejection. And that's what happens. So you do the advertising, you got 100 to 1. So let's take the advertising, go to 100 to 1. And so how many would we need? If I want 29 new patients, right? 29, so take 29 times 100. How many hits is that? 2,900, roughly 3,000 hits, 3,000. Are you going to do that? Are you going to spend the money that it takes to do that? Generally, the advertising doesn't work, especially if the doctor doesn't know 2 things. He can pay for the advertising, whether it's pay-per-click, whatever, and you get a smaller number of patients, but when the doctor doesn't know how to keep them and he doesn't know how to get referrals, the money doesn't cut it. The doctor loses money. But when the doctor actually knows how to keep the patient and create referrals, that's usually the only time spending the money on advertising works. So you have to have a doctor who actually knows how to pay. He actually has to know patient retention. And that's not a lot. From 30 years of practice, in my experience, I'd say only 20% of chiropractors actually know how to keep somebody for the 3 phases of healing. When I do practice analysis, usually 1/3 to half the patients are gone by the 6th to 8th visit. That's what I routinely see when I do chiropractors practice analysis. They lose patients left and right. And a lot of times they don't even know it because they don't even keep the statistics. The only thing they know is they need more new patients because they're bleeding them left and right. But they don't even know they're bleeding them because they don't keep stats. So you come over to this, go, well, how many hits am I going to need? 3,000. Well, how much money is that going to cost you? It's going to cost a little bit of money. Going to cost some money. That's like I was just talking to an advertiser with pay-per-click. They guarantee, I think they said 30 to 40 new patients within 90 days, right? You go, well, that's pretty good. How much do they cost? $3,500 a month. Do you have $3,500 a month to get about 10 to 12 new patients a month? Well, they don't accept you if you can't prepay 50% of them. Well, guess why they don't accept you for their marketing? Because you won't be able to afford it. So if you don't even know how to prepay them, you won't even be able to make the money to pay them to continue the ad. Now, if you know how to prepay them and you know how to get referrals from those people, $3,500 is a pretty good deal. If your referral, like I had a 74% referral rate. So I get 30 or 40 new patients. I'm creating another 20 out of them. Then out of those 20, I'm creating another 10. Out of those 10, I'm creating another 5. See? So I spend $3,500. I get the 40, I get the 20, I get the 10 and the 5. 40, 50, 60, 70, 85 new patients from $3,500 because I know how to keep them and I know how to create business from them. Whole different, see, $3,500 to me is nothing now. Now that's the last source. The very last source that you want to consider when you're doing this is advertising. Why? Because you can't control it. There's only one rule with advertising. It's eventually guaranteed not to work. So you always make advertising the cream of the cake, not the cake. Unfortunately, most doctors that don't know marketing, that's their whole cake. Every time I do practice analysis with new clients, the vast majority, over 50% of their business comes from advertising. What does that mean? It's bad business, costs a lot of money. It's the worst kind of people to deal with, and it's not going to be dependable month to month. That's what it means. Well, that's not true when you actually know how to create business. You actually know educational sales, and you actually know how to talk to 10 of your patients and get their family, their spouse, mother, father as new patients. There's a whole big difference. What did that cost? Nothing. That cost me nothing to do that. It took knowledge and skill to do it, but it cost me nothing. The doctor's paying $3,500 a month that's losing them in 6 to 8 visits. He can't even pay him again. That's why they will not even take him. They won't even take that doctor on because they already know they don't want to waste their time with him. They're going to do it one time and the doctor can't afford to do it again. They're smart enough to do that. They're smart enough to say, we're not going to take you unless you prepay your patients 50% and the case average is over $1,000. See, they're smart enough to know that. That takes knowledge and skill. So here's where we are. We're looking at the spectrum. We're going, well, there's a whole spectrum of what works best to what's terrible and costs a lot of money. So we're going to go into all of those. And they take different skill levels. It doesn't take no skill at all to do advertising. I can just pay money and have somebody do it. It takes a lot of knowledge and skill to do educational sales. It doesn't cost any money and get you way more business than you physically can handle, because that's the only marketing that gets the 92% of the population that's not looking for a chiropractor. Advertising won't do it. Publicity won't do it. So the total abundance of new patients is the knowledge and skill, not just having the ability to do it and create it at will, but the market's way bigger. That represents 68% of the population versus 8%. You have a much bigger market, much greater opportunity. So we're gonna dissect it down. We're gonna go into each of the categories and go, well, how many hits are you gonna need? Well, if it's a one-to-one relationship, I'm only gonna need 29. Let's say it's down to 3-to-1. Well, now I'm gonna need 90. What if it gets to 5-to-1? Let's say your marketing is not as good and it's 5-to-1. Now you're going to need 150. Are you willing to do 150 hits to create 29 new patients? What's the only thing that's going to do that? Purpose. You got to have a reason to change what you're doing, to get out of the mundane, to stop your habits that are keeping you at your exact level. You got to have a strong purpose. Then you have to have the knowledge to do it. And the doctors who have both of those are the doctors that do very well. Those are the doctors that see way more than 200 visits a week. They bring on one associate doctor, 2 associate doctors. They open their second office, their third office, their fourth office. In other words, new patients and patient visits are never a problem for the doctor with a purpose and has been trained. It's never a problem. Those are the wealth creating doctors. The doctors who don't have a purpose, don't have a focus, don't have a plan, those are the doctors that stay stagnant. How do you know who you are? Look at the last quarters for the last year. Have you stayed stagnant every quarter for the last 2, 3, 4 quarters? You're that doctor. You don't have a purpose. You don't have a plan. That's why you're staying where you're at. Until that changes, nothing's going to change. No matter how much you know. If you're not willing to act on it, nothing's going to change. So you not only have to know it, but you have to be willing to act on it. And that's what the purpose is about. What are you willing to do? What are you willing to do? What fears and energy are you willing to overcome to create the lifestyle of your dreams? That's what it's about. That's where it all starts. So it doesn't matter if I give a doctor the total blueprint he has no purpose, no direction, no goal. It's worthless. It's like handing him gold and he doesn't even know what to do with it. It's worthless. So let me leave it like that because this is going to take a little bit longer. We're going to cover part 2 in the next webinar. We're going to go into each marketing system, what's effectiveness, how many hits is it going to take, and then you decide whether you want to do it or not. You might be somebody that's good at the front end. You go, like, I'm good at all this. Well, it's not going to take a whole lot of hits, so to speak, for you to create that business. You go, well, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm the kind of doctor that's more based on advertising. Well, it's going to cost you a lot of money. It's going to be one or the other, or somewhere in the middle. Or you're just going to stay exactly where you're at. Nothing's going to change. You've got to make those decisions. This is the pathway, forward or staying stagnant. So in the next session, we're going to cover all the different marketing systems, and then we're going to cover the hits. Well, what is the expectation? In other words, how many new patients can I expect from that? As an example, and I'll finish with this, I get in front of any of my patients, any of their spouses that live under the same roof, because there's high trust, high awareness, and if they have any kind of a chiropractic problem, and I apply educational sales, I got them. It'll be a 1-to-1. I'll get all of them. Matter of fact, educational sales is so well, if I do it to a total cold call evidence where there's no trust and there's no leads, we don't even know if they have a problem. But remember, I know statistically they do. I'll get 7 out of 10 because the system is so good. The educational sales system is so good. I'll get 7 out of 10. So what system are you using? What's the reason, the motivation you're doing it, or why you're not doing it? I see this a lot with attorneys. A lot of doctors are not willing to overcome their fears to introduce themselves and become the authority with the attorney. Their purpose does not exceed their fear. There you go. The plan is there. Another example is when we go after, when we do our educational sales to an existing patient. Well, if that existing patient has a spouse that has a gateway problem, we have a 1 in 3 chance we're going to get him as a patient. Now, this is third party. If I was in front of them doing it, it'd be 1-to-1. But if it's third party, it's 3-to-1. So if it's 3-to-1, how many hits am I going to need? 60. And this is a high ratio. And this is one of the big things doctors don't understand. It's not a 1-to-1 relationship unless you're like a black belt in educational sales. It's way more than 1. You can't just want, that's like reactivations. It's usually 10-to-1. You got to call 10 people to get 1 to come in. How many of you are willing to call 10 people before you quit? How many of you are willing to ask 3, 4, 5 times for a referral before you even quit? That's the problem. You haven't written it down. You don't have, if you're not doing it, it's because you haven't written it down. You don't have a strong enough purpose to overcome your fears and inhibitions, and you're not applying the plan. Because we got the plan. The plan has been proven for 30 plus years, over and over and over. For the people who apply it. For the people who don't apply it, it doesn't work. It's a proven blueprint, period. And as a last example, I had a new doctor learn educational sales. He did the new patient orientation. He had 7 potential new patients. 7. He signed up 10. That was greater than 1-to-1. You go, well, how the hell can he sign up 10 new patients if there are only 7 in the audience? All 7 of them signed up and 3 of them signed up their spouse. He did that twice. He got more people signed up. That was the power of circle of influence with educational sales. And he was willing to do it. That same doctor has an associate doctor. He increased his business over $600,000 his first year. His was a combination of pain, survival security. He was seeing 30 visits a week. His house was in foreclosure. He had nothing, and he was losing his marriage. Well, you can imagine all kinds of family problems you have when you're seeing 30 visits a week. And he was the sole breadwinner. His life was crashing. Why do I say that? Because it created a tremendous amount of pain, created a tremendous amount of motivation for him to overcome his fears, to learn how to do the educational sales, get in front of the people to do it, and then he knew how to keep them. He totally changed his life in 12 months. He went from 30 visits a week to 200 visits a week, another associate doctor, and over $600,000 increase. Why? He had a plan, he had a number, he had a blueprint, and he damn well had the motivation. That's why. That same doctor has 2 associate doctors now, and he doesn't practice. He manages.